Good evening, Mistake. Right now I will be recording and explaining my book review of all three books that I read for this project, I suppose. Welcome to my bedroom. I'm Ling, you know this already. So, starting off with the first book, we'll be doing this in chronological order. I'll be giving you short summaries of everything, then going over some questions I've written, things I want to talk about, and a few things I have written down in some of the books and my notes that I took. So our first book is Murders in the Rue Morgue. It was published in 1841. Essentially, this book was mostly about how a detective finds a story about these two women who were brutally murdered in their own home. And what really stumped the police force and the investigators who were assigned to this was how brutally these women were murdered. Because they couldn't figure out how the murderer escaped, because they were thinking inside the box. They thought, oh, well, a human had to do this, but how could a human have the raw, brutal strength to shove somebody's head first? Up, or no, it was feet first. It was feet first. How to shove someone feet first up a chimney, because that's a lot more limbs to manage to go up than the way that your body contorts when you're being shoved with your head, because you have four limbs and to be able to have all four of your limbs shoved up a chimney with gravity pulling down on you, that really stumped them. And they were also stumped by how brutal these murders were. So specifically the bodily mutilation. So there was decapitation, bruises, her limbs were badly injured, there were bone fractures, it was just brutal. And specifically, a quote from the story was, "What has occurred that has never occurred before?" And at the time in the story, events like this weren't things to be expected, For the most part, a regular human can't shove someone up a chimney that easily and still manage to escape. And the detectives were stumped by their mode of egress, which is a noun. It's the action of going out or leaving a place. And you'll find that within the short story there is a large amount of time dedicated to figuring out the mode of egress. And it was just wow. I got the chills from Helter Skelter because I knew that was real, but going into this, before it was revealed who the murderer was, wow. I find that the way that the author decided to write I found the way that the author decided to depict the murderer as animalistic without actually being an animal at first was interesting. It was showed that there was a hesitation that the acts that were achieved here weren't necessarily normal. And I find it ironic to a certain degree. I find it rather funny that at the end of the story that the murderer was revealed to be an orangutan, because only an orangutan would be capable of such hideous crimes and murders, right? I mean, that's what they believed in 1841. But that was Murders in the Rue Morgue. Even though animalistic murders were not exactly expected in 1841, we unfortunately got to witness that they happened in 1969 outside of fiction with the Manson family murders. So Helter Skelter, it was the true crime book. It features the horrific event of the Manson murders. In case you don't know, the Manson family murdered 5 rich and famous individuals back in 1969 to free them and let them pass on to a heaven. This was because their leader, Charles Manson, had a god complex, and because he was charismatic enough, he convinced his followers to listen to him and participate. And I mean, the stuff that happened in that book, dear Lord, the stuff that happened in that book. But I mean, particularly one of the things that struck me from that book that made me physically retch was from page 140. was within a couple of months after his birth, she began fellating him. So this is in reference to Susan, and she murdered the Tates. She was the one who killed them, specifically Sharon Tate. And it's just, I mean, this woman, Susan, she gave birth to her son, and she decided that when he was a few months old, she would perform fellatio on her. Fellatio? On her little baby, right? That's messed up. That's really messed up. And unfortunately, I can't just say, oh, no, that wasn't real. Because it was real. And it happened. And that makes me really uncomfortable. But, I mean, this is just the overview, and I'll get a bit more into depth about all three of these books here in a second. But 2018, The Crooked Room. It was published back then by Rick Pyle. And The Crooked Room is a short story, an internet story called a creepypasta. And it depicts from a first-person view the horrors of being the person who is sacrificed. You'll find that within these three narratives, or I guess there's these three books. There's a lot of human sacrifice, a lot of drug use, a lot of rich people. I mean, there's something about being rich and drugs that somehow leads to murder, apparently. I realize you can't see my hands. I have hands. But, I mean, so the Crooked Room focuses around this concept called the selection, and every 20 years, the Alden family needs to have a sort of raffle where each family member's name is entered, and they draw one unsuspectingly to sacrifice them to the devil so their family can remain wealthy because they're greedy. And this story is unlike the other two because it's told from a first-person perspective. It's entirely fiction, which contrasts with the events of Helter Skelter, but also allows us to realize a connection between Murders in the Rue Morgue, Helter Skelter, and The Crooked Room. Now, all three of these are different. I'd like to say they're different genres. Murders in the Rue Morgue happened in the 1800s. It was a detective narrative. Yeah, it was a gruesome murder. All of these have gruesome murders. But it was a detective narrative. Flashing forward like a century and a half, or actually just a century to like 1969, it was Helter Skelter. Well, that's when the events took place, at least. The book wasn't written in 1969. But Helter Skelter is a true crime novel. More importantly, it's a retelling of one of the detectives, along with, like, the actual events that happened. And within Murders in the Rue Morgue, there are gruesome murders. Helter Skelter, gruesome murders. The Manson murders featured 5 individuals who got brutally murdered in each of their own ways. There was a common theme of rope being tied around people's necks. One of the murderers recounted saying that she wished that she had enough time to carve the baby out of the pregnant woman's stomach, and to slash that up as well, which isn't necessarily pleasant. But all three of these stories feature the themes of human sacrifice and mutilation, where human sacrifice itself can kind of be squeezed in there with Murders in the Rue Morgue. It wasn't really necessarily built around the concept of human sacrifice. Rather, these individuals were being brutally murdered. So, at the bare minimum, all three of these accounts feature mutilation of humans, which is unfortunate. But the similarities that they all have are drug use, murder, rich people, and incompetent police forces. So let's start with drug use. Murders in the Rue Morgue was probably the least offensive on, like, the drug use scale. The 2 women who were murdered used tobacco. That's about it. Tobacco itself is still a drug, though, so I'm going to keep it in here in the list of drug use. As for murder, 2 people were murdered in Murders in the Rue Morgue. Helter Skelter had 5 people murdered, and The Crooked Room has no direct murders told in the story, but it is heavily implied that the main character's mother was murdered for the human sacrifice, and that countless times in the past people had been murdered or insane to pass the family's trials. In all 3 stories, the people who were murdered were rich, filthy rich. The women in Murders and the Rue Morgue were able to retire early, and they lived off of this savings fund that they have for a while, which was eventually used to question individuals to see if they had any knowledge about what had happened, but unfortunately that was a dead end. As for Helter Skelter, literally everyone who died was rich. And it's because Charles Manson wanted to make an impact, to make it clear that, hey, I want you dead, but it's not because I hate you, unless you're a capitalist pig. And in The Crooked Room, the entire the storyline is the fact that they're rich because they made a deal with the devil. And, I mean, being rich, am I right? But another thing we focus on is the incompetent police force. Now, that's not as big of an issue with Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Crooked Room as it is with Helter Skelter. Because Rue Morgue and The Crooked Room are both acts of fiction. Helter Skelter is true crime. And in Murders in the Rue Morgue, it shares the same incompetency, I'd like to say, with the police as Helter Skelter. This is because the audacity of both crimes was overwhelming for the police forces and the investigators. They weren't sure what the motive would be, who would do it, because, I mean, yes, people had lots of grudges against these people, but would they go that far to have such a disgusting murder, you know? Whereas in The Crooked Room, the police doesn't even intervene. And I could go on a side tangent, but I'm just going to add the topic of being rich lets you pay off stuff, and you can avoid the government. But these are the main similarities between these 3 books, and I will be getting into more depth of these in all 3 books in my presentation. This is just in place of the book reviews. My personal thoughts while reading. I'd like to start with talking about, probably with Murders in the Rue Morgue. I feel as though just the whole concept of just egress in this story, and I will go into depth in this again, but as stated previously, egress is the action of going out or leaving a place. And the investigator, the detective, focused so heavily on egress in this. It makes you think, does egress have an ulterior meaning within the story? Obviously, it just means to leave, but our author made the villain something so inconceivably odd. He chose an orangutan. And I'd like to think that maybe it was egress, but not just leaving a place, but leaving one's own expectations. Because in the story, it's clear that everyone expected it to be a man, but the feats of this man were unheard of for human strength and power. And by, at the end, pulling the twist that our murderer was indeed an orangutan, I mean, maybe he was just writing that as just a gentle twist. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. But I mean, human beings have evolved from chimpanzees and orangutans. So, to an extension, was he saying that potentially these orangutans are an extension of ourselves? That these orangutans are what the human should not be capable of? Maybe one could even say it would be an act of egress for us to leave our own personal confines of our limitations of our mortal bodies. We aren't, for the most part, as strong as an orangutan. And maybe our author was poking at that, saying that it's a good thing that we aren't. Because the orangutan was primal. It was scared. And I'm going to sneeze. I apologize. I'm sorry. But the orangutan was primal, and it was very, very scared. So perhaps we can infer that this was a metaphor. Maybe not as intentional as I would like it to be, but it could be seen as a metaphor. And with that in mind, I think that's something we should ponder on. Just sit and let it stew for a little bit to talk about it. This is already getting kind of long, though. So I'll move on to Helter Skelter. Helter Skelter itself disgusted me. A lot. Not with, like, the writing, but what actually happened. That disgusted me. Like, thoroughly. Let's see here. Yeah. Talking about Helter Skelter within itself. It was a wild ride to read. I didn't finish it because I don't have enough time to finish it, to finish this entire project on time, but Helter Skelter put emotions into me that I didn't want to feel. Mainly disgust. But, I mean, it's astounding that a man with a god complex would be able to convince enough people to join his cult and not feel shame or guilt about murdering people. In our modern era. I mean, 1969. That wasn't that long ago. It's like 2019. That's 50 years ago. Is it 50 or 40? It's 50 years ago. And it's happened before, it'll probably happen again. And these cult ideologies, I mean, the level of charisma that it would take to convince people that you are a, like, living, walking embodiment of God, and then convince them that committing these, like, atrocious murders, ending other people's lives, for no reason other than the fact that you want to, like, make a big deal and scare some people and pass some people on to let them live a better life in your quote-unquote heaven. That's not cool. That's not cool. But it happened. And that scares me a little. 'Cause, I mean, it could happen again. It could happen again. And I really don't know how to feel about that. I'm gonna move on to the Crooked Room now. The Crooked Room was a horrible read. It was bad. It was so badly written. They took first person and they slaughtered it. It was not well written at all. But I do enjoy the concepts of the selection. And how this, like, large family called, like, the Aldens was totally okay with human sacrifice as long as they could stay rich. And that really makes you think about, like, the 7 deadly sins, quote unquote. Specifically greed. And how, like, this sense of, like, human greed has permeated, it stays with us, it's kept us alive at times, but it's not great. And I think that that's interesting. I think that the author was onto something there. The issue with the Crooked Room and analyzing it, is the fact that our main character, Bram, ends the story by implying that he's in a psych ward and that he's tied up constantly. Meaning that our author is untrustworthy. Our narrator is an untrustworthy narrator, and we aren't certain if the events in the story actually have happened, or that this is just some sort of cushion that Bram has created for himself to feel safe in his surroundings, and to justify why he's in the psych ward. And I mean, like, there's this like large focus about sacrificing loved ones for financial gain. While where this hasn't happened in the other two stories, it is an act of human sacrifice, which we have seen in the other two stories. The cricket room itself was interesting, and I mean, it made me think, like, if I had the opportunity to, like, make a deal with the devil, but every 20 years one of my family members has to die, including myself potentially, that doesn't really sound worth it, you know? Like, I don't want to live to only be 20. I'll be 20 in 4 years. That's not that far away. That's kind of spooky, right? I don't want to die at 20. I don't want to die at 40 or 60. 80 would be okay. But, I mean, even though it's just an act of fiction, it really makes you think, like, how far are you willing to go for personal financial gain? How far are you willing to go for any gain in general? If you had an opportunity to make a deal with a quote-unquote devil to get whatever you want, like the monkey's paw, you know, you can get what you ask for, but you don't get what you asked for. Saying, oh, I want a cup that never goes empty. It'll be granted, but the cup is constantly overflowing forever. You know? A blessing and a curse. And I wonder, how far would one be willing to go? So I have a few questions that I wrote. What does it take to be willing to sacrifice another human? I personally struggle with accepting my own mortality at times, and realizing that my personal experiences aren't the experiences of everyone else, and that my personal existence isn't everyone else's. I'm not the protagonist. Nothing surrounds me constantly. I struggle with the realization that my room, my existence, will one day no longer exist. That this recording will exist as long as YouTube exists. That it will always be watchable until the platform goes down. That one day my existence will be, like, properly eradicated from, like, the history of mankind. That's scary. That's really, really scary. And I wonder, what does it take to be willing to snuff out another life form as complex as yours, whose thoughts and, like, memories you'll never know? No one will ever know them as well as they knew themselves. So what does it take to be able to be willing to do that? What does it take? What is that crime punishable by death? Is murdering another person punishable by the death sentence? Is this constant cycle of bloodshed really worth it? And it scares me that some people are actually willing to murder another person. And I don't understand how that could be justified. Like, maybe revenge. Revenge is petty. It's really petty. And I don't understand it. I don't understand how murder or sacrifice or any of these ideologies can be justified. I really don't. And that scares me. Moving on to God complexes. I mean, Charles Manson had a God complex. And I wonder how one's psyche could be warped and twisted to believe that you are God. I apologize, but I'd like to state this now. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in a God. I respect you if you do, though. You have your own opinions, and that's totally okay. But even if a God were to exist, he wouldn't form himself in this person willing to murder. I feel as though that would be wrong. Obviously, my moral compass is different than the one of Charles Manson. But I don't understand that. And like most humans, I'm scared of what I don't understand. And it will make me act irrationally one day. Unfortunately. But that scares me. And in these situations where I understand that within history and like mythology, people believed that the gods existed. They would sacrifice people for fertility and sacrifice people for water. And it makes sense that, offering up a life form, the very essence and soul of a being, this individual who can never be replaced, it makes sense that they would equate that to prosperity and hoping that their benevolent God would give them more. But I personally can't wrap my head around it. I understand it, but I can't seem to justify it internally. Because I struggle a lot with accepting my own mortality, and I get really existential at times, and I disassociate from the present. Meaning that sometimes I'll be sitting there, and I'll have the sudden realization that everything I'm doing will never matter. I matter in the moment, but a century from now I won't. When I am long gone, and all the people who knew of me, who knew my name, are dead, when I become another face on Ancestry.com, I don't matter anymore. I'm one in, 7.5 billion. And I don't matter. Our political figureheads, they don't matter. One day we'll all be dead. The ones of us who can make a difference, they're just going to be another name in the textbooks. But I appreciate the difference that we can make now. And I don't understand the concept of, God complexes and, the will to sacrifice others. Because being able to do that it's cold-hearted. It means you haven't taken enough time to reflect on yourselves and the situations of those around you and realize that they're just as mortal as you are. We're just as mortal as our neighbors. We're not going to live forever. We might as well make a difference while we can. And maybe Charles Manson thought that to himself. Maybe he sat down and thought, okay, I want to make a big difference. I want the whole world to know. So we got some people together and murdered 5 celebrities. A coffee heiress. He murdered them. He made a difference, but not necessarily the difference that he should have made. He was charismatic. He had the ability to warp people to do what he wanted to. He could have become a political figurehead in the whole game of politics, but he didn't. He chose enlightenment. And it makes me wonder, how many more people like him are we going to see? What are they going to do? Are they going to manipulate us and move us to where they want? Or are we going to become their little political pawns? Because Charles Manson talked a lot about political piggies. Specifically, they used the word pig a lot. Not just oink oink pork, but disgusting, vile humans, individuals. And maybe, despite his charisma, he knew that he could have become a political pig, as he would say. But he chose not to. He chose not to play the game. And I think that that's something that's really interesting to think on. This recording's about half an hour long. On a scale of 1 to 10, I'm gonna rate the books. Murders in the Rue Morgue. Actually no. 1, we'll never read again. 10, wow. 5, oh, that was a pretty average book. So Murders in the Rue Morgue, I'd put it at a solid 6. It was better than average for me. I enjoyed it. The ending was lackluster. It was lackluster. It started too slow, the ending was lackluster, and it focused aggressively on a topic that wasn't even mentioned for the rest of the book. Helter Skelter, solid 8. Honestly, I think that was a pretty good book. Um, I enjoyed the fact that it was true crime. Crooked Room, 2. Bad, bad, bad writing. I don't enjoy first person stories, but it was nice to get another viewpoint than I usually get. It was nice to try something different. Have a nice evening, Mistake. I'll see you later.